Incapacitating. It's the worst fear that you can experience.
They just did not let up. It was every day I could count on at least one, and sometimes a day there would be 3 and 4 a day.
Sometimes 2 or 3 an hour at my worst.
It'll scare you. You think you're dying. You think you're just losing your mind. You know, you don't know what to think.
Welcome back. Dr. Schoberg, we had an opportunity to hear from the client's perspective how this felt for them. Can you tell us a little more about panic disorder?
Well, panic disorder is something that may or may not have some biochemical basis in the brain. Certainly, we think that those panics that come out of the blue, for example, a person waking up in the middle of the night and they're in the midst of a panic attack, we make the assumption often that in these instances there's probably something biochemically imbalanced in the brain. So these are cases where medication can be a helpful adjunct to psychotherapy to help the client. In other cases, the panic attacks seem to happen in very overstimulating environments, like a person may be at the supermarket, which is a very stimulating environment with the bright colors and the noise and the temperature changes and so forth. This is a popular place for people to develop panic reactions because of the very stimulating nature of the environment. And I mentioned earlier how these people tend to have very sensitive personalities. So you bring that together with a highly stimulating environment, like freeway driving or being in a supermarket or a large group of people, and they will begin to feel this reaction. Now, when the reaction occurs, the mind tends to make an automatic connection between the stimulus situation the person is in at that moment, the particular physical situation that they're in. Let's say they're mailing a letter at the post office and they're having a panic attack.
Okay.
The mind automatically begins to associate being at that post office with having this panic reaction. So the person then, his natural tendency is to begin to avoid that situation with that particular post office. He may go to a different post office, but one day he's in the second post office and he's looking around and he's saying to himself, gee, this looks a lot like that place that I had my last panic attack. And sure enough, as he begins these negative thought patterns, the panic attack can often recur. And this is how it can begin to spread from one situation to another, where a person sort of sees a similarity to that initial situation where they had a reaction. So they'll start to develop more and more panic reactions in more and more situations, which is why often this leads directly to agoraphobia. Why a panic disorder often is accompanied by agoraphobia, because the person begins to avoid more and more situations, and that's the key.
I'm sorry. So when you say, okay, I begin to associate specific situations, which I know we call simple phobias, which is fear of specific things, events, and objects, that if we can talk ourselves at some level into that level of panic, can we not talk ourselves down from it? I mean, isn't it one approach for somebody to say, okay, I know what this is a panic attack, okay, and then remind themselves to breathe and that sort of thing? I mean,
well, it's not quite as simple as that,
okay,
because the feelings that are engendered by a panic attack are so overwhelming for most people. They are completely beyond the realm of what they're used to dealing with.
Okay.
The feelings of doom, especially. The feelings that their mind might be fragmenting, that they might go crazy, or that they might have a heart attack or a stroke. Something physically might happen that will be irreversible in the body. That's why so many of them end up in emergency rooms, yes, initially, before they know what they're suffering from. So this can be a real problem. You just cannot think that the person is necessarily going to apply willpower to overcome this, because it is so overwhelming. However, thinking is an important part of the recovery process. The type of therapy that is used for anxiety disorders is what we call cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yes.
This has been found to be the most effective for this kind of problem. We know that the traditional talking therapy, traditional psychoanalytic methods psychodynamic therapy does not work very well for anxiety disorders. Actually, it takes a long time to do classical psychoanalysis, as you well
Yes,
know.
it does.
Sometimes 7 or 8 years, going 3 or 4 times a week. Most people can't afford that in this day and age.
No.
So the cognitive behavioral therapy approach refers to, the cognitive part refers to the restructuring of negative thinking that often supports the anxiety problem. So that involves learning to ferret out what are the negative beliefs that the person is functioning with that are supporting this system, and how those can be modified through correct thinking, through sort of reprogramming the mind so that you think differently about anxiety and about its effects. The behavioral part refers to specific techniques that we use to train people to reduce the frequency of anxiety, to reduce the duration and the intensity when it does occur, so that they get more of a sense that they're in control, that they can learn to master this situation.
You've hit on an important point, because I know when I have had clients in my office talking about this level of anxiety and their difficulty managing their lives around it, they do talk about the control issue as central. I mean, above all, the fear is I'm losing control, and I can no longer predict how I'm going to behave and how I'm going to feel in any given situation. And it truly, as I understand it, is quite a powerless feeling, powerless situation.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of, I don't know, in terms of identifying panic disorder, I mean, we talked about people going into the hospital. I've had people tell me it's taken them maybe 5 or 6 trips into the hospital before somebody says, this is a panic disorder, this is an anxiety disorder. Why is that so difficult?
Well, physicians, until recently, have not really been oriented to diagnosing this. They may say, well, it's your nerves, or some dismissive comment like that,
Okay.
which doesn't help the person feel any better, of course.
Okay.
But once they do get a definitive diagnosis that this is a definite anxiety disorder, it can be pointed to in the DSM-4, which is the statistical manual of the Psychiatric Association. Once they have a name that they can place on this condition that is fairly specific, and they can learn something about it, they can do some reading about it, it demystifies the condition to some degree. And that's the first step in recovery, is learning that anxiety doesn't have to be a monster that is controlling you, that is on your back like a demon that is impossible to do anything with. So learning just the name, often clients will tell me, when I found out it was a panic disorder or agoraphobia, whatever, it was great relief, because I knew that other people had this. I wasn't alone, and many people with this problem feel initially like they're the only ones in the world that have it. And furthermore, they often feel that they may be going crazy, that they could become psychotic from this problem, and that is not true.
And so then begin to have some shame and some fear about sharing that with other people, I imagine. It becomes pretty secretive. Now, I would imagine there are people who, prior to getting a diagnosis, may sometimes attempt to treat their own symptoms, perhaps with alcohol or perhaps medication.
Exactly. The National Institute of Mental Health, for example, estimates that probably as many as 45% of all alcoholics begin as having an anxiety disorder, and they begin to self-medicate by using alcohol and perhaps other drugs.
And in fact, I know in my experience with my clients, I have a specialty in recovery, and many of them began drinking and using around the same time as the adolescent peer pressure about attending parties and socialization. And often what we'll find is social phobia diagnosis as they begin to get clean and sober, which is a serious problem, because the way many people manage their sobriety is to go to 12-step meetings and AA, and these meetings can be quite large. And so then we have the situation where we have somebody who would like to get clean and sober and stay that way, but to do that traditionally requires either group therapy or group support.
Indeed.
And how do you help individuals like this?
Well, if they do have this social phobia, which you referred to, this, of course, means that they have difficulty even introducing themselves in public, perhaps, which is going to be a real problem at an AA meeting.
Yes.
Where you have to eventually participate. They try to compensate for that by telling you at the beginning, if you're a new member, you don't have to say anything until you feel more comfortable. So I think they're aware of the fact that this social phobic problem can be a big issue at these meetings. You hear a lot of talk about fear at 12-step meetings.
Yes, you do.
They don't usually mention anxiety disorders, or maybe they do today more. But there's a great deal of emphasis on the fear that begins to well up as the person no longer is using the self-medication of alcohol. So this definitely can be an issue. Of course, it's even more of an issue for someone who has to perform in public. And you know, I work a fair amount with musicians, with public speakers who are having trouble, or managers in a company that have to go to meetings and present. In the Silicon Valley here, this is a particularly heavy issue. If you want to career advance, you have to be able to hold your own in a meeting.
Yep.
And I've worked with numerous people that have a big problem in this area of being able to stand up and present in a group.
And part of that fear, as I understand it, is fear that you're going to, it's almost as though the spotlight is on you, you know, and that fear that somehow I'm going to say something humiliating or embarrassing, or going to, you know, totally shame myself.
That's right. It's like being under scrutiny.
Yeah.
And that is what people with this problem find it most difficult to deal with, is the idea that they're under scrutiny and that other people may be having negative thoughts about them. They make all kinds of conjectures about this, which increases the negative thinking that I referred to earlier, which supports this problem.
And in reality, what is often true in my experience, particularly in group settings, is people tend to be pretty focused on how they are themselves presenting. I mean, in general, many of us are fairly self-focused. And so are not, in fact, expending a lot of energy evaluating other people.
Well, that's a very good point, and I try to make that point as part of that cognitive restructuring, that most people are preoccupied with their own thoughts, with their own issues, and they're not really going to be looking for every little tremulous movement in your cheek or whatever when you're speaking. And so, but most people, when they start, who have this problem, they're thinking that everyone is totally focused on watching for every little nuance of difficulty in speaking, of tremulousness or whatever in their voice.
I'll tell you what cured me of that was when I used to do a lot of teaching, and I discovered that my students, when I would ask them afterwards what we talked about, would remember only a small portion. So no matter how profound I was, you know, didn't necessarily make an enormous impact. I want to thank you for being with us tonight. I appreciate you being here. I want to thank you for joining us. Join us next week as we learn what we can do to help our aging parents and ourselves as our roles begin to switch. I'm Mary Crocker Cook, and this is Bay Area Psychology. Good night.